So in this session, we're going to hear from technologists and service providers for some insight into the subject of latency. Why is it important? When isn't it so important? What can be done to improve it? What's likely to happen in future to enable the delivery of high-quality signals as quickly and efficiently as possible? So to introduce my panel to you, we have next to me Steve Russell. Steve is Chief Product Officer at Redbee Media, the global media services business working across playout, OTT, media management, distribution, access services, live and post-production. Just next to Steve is Julien Libeau, Product Manager at Worldcast Connect, which provides network management systems that provide oversight of OTT, satellite, cable and telco media infrastructures, capturing data and providing actionable insights. And on the end, we have Chris Wilson. Chris is Director of Market Development Sports at Mediakind, which enables and monetizes scalable live streaming engagement experiences and highly valuable content personalization for sports fans across the globe. So, to get us started, Julien, if I may, how would you define latency? If we start right at the beginning, just to kind of set some terms and definitions, if you like. How would you define it? Is it from camera to screen, for example?
Well, I would say that latency in real world can be defined as if you are watching a football game on OTT, for example, and your neighbor is watching the same game on regular television and is cheering on score, and then you have to wait 30 seconds. That's kind of a real-life experience of latency, and not just like spoiling the game to the consumer on the OTT part, but it can also affect how the consumer will see actually the service that is provided by the provider.
And Steve, what sort of numbers are we talking about here if we're comparing different services, different ways of consuming content? What sort of numbers in terms of seconds worth of delay would we be talking about?
If you're at the ground, speed of light.
Yeah.
If you're watching over a traditional kind of broadcast network, probably somewhere between 7 to 10 seconds delay, DTH platform, something like that. And then in the OTT space, I guess that's the discussion that we're going to get into, can vary a lot. I mean, I think some of the early streaming services were 30 to 45 seconds delay, which is where this whole discussion starts to emerge from. And then you can move to low latency, which may be 5 to 10 seconds delay, to ultra low latency, which might be 1 to 3 seconds delay, and different solutions in the market to achieve those outcomes.
And Chris, just to sort of pick up on the points that Julien made, why does it matter? Why is it an issue?
Well, I think everyone's had that experience, right? Everyone's seen and heard the shouts from the house next door, or they've seen the text message come through to their phone 30 seconds before they see the actual event happen on their TV. So from a viewing experience perspective, latency is really important. And like you said, you build it up everywhere through that chain. And actually, I would probably say if we got a show of hands in the audience, everyone would have a different opinion on what they think an acceptable amount of latency is, depending on the situation, right? And I think ultimately it comes down to what you feel is important. But really, just looking at pure experience perspective, you don't want your TV experience to be interrupted or broken by another source of information. Right, and that's fundamentally the issue. Now, as we'll move on to later, right, latency is also important because it helps to unlock a whole bunch of use cases and opportunities in your video. But really, the conversation I think most people have been having is about how it's affecting or impacting that viewing experience.
So, which of the parts of the workflow would you say that cause most of these issues around latency?
All of them. as a starting point, right? Everything, no matter what piece of equipment or what process you're doing, you're adding latency through that chain. So you have to really optimize that, you have to go through and tune every part and adjust every part of that chain to bring that latency down. Yeah. Now, and this is where we're getting into the definitions, right, of what is it. Some people say low latency or ultra low latency. And I think for me, really, it's about equivalency. So, you know, there's a part of that chain that's not going to change, whether you're doing an OTT service, a broadcast service, or you're viewing it in the production environment, right? You've got inherent delays and latency that goes through that. So really, it's about equivalency. You know, what is my equivalent broadcast latency as a starting point? What is then the latency that I get when my friend texts me and it takes them about 1 second to get the text through? That's completely outside the broadcast chain, right? So no matter what you did, even if I was a broadcaster going through a traditional DTH platform, I'd suffer from that, right? So really, it's about equivalency and where do you want that latency to be for your experience?
And Julien, I guess in order to reach these conclusions, we have to have some degree of understanding about those different parts of the workflow. So measurement is really an important part of this analysis, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. I think that in the whole process of creating content and distributing content, monitoring is now really important at the beginning of a project, especially now that we are that we have a lot of products in the cloud and that we don't have the full control of all the chain, like the network sometimes, or the latency that can be introduced being the source, and then the cloud transformation that we can add to it. So monitoring is now a full part of the design, and in the planning it will help also to provide the good amount of capacity on the network to know what are the standard of each products, of each services that you include in your chain, and will help a lot then during the operation to the maintenance team, the operation, the engineers, to see if there is some changes or trends that are going up regarding those kind of issues.
And is that process of monitoring, is that achievable retrospectively, or does it need to be kind of factored in from the sort of early stages of design of an OTT service?
Well, it's achievable afterwards, but designing it, planning it within the construction of the services is also really great in terms of gathering the data at the beginning, then allow improvement with all the data that we are getting in the monitoring systems, improving the workflow with all those data, in some continuous improvement workflow. So I think that the monitoring has to be built at the beginning with the project, so that you can always improve then with the addition of streams or services inside the workflow.
And then what happens to that data? Where does it go? Does it go on to vendors and manufacturers and all of those elements in that chain?
Well, the data that we get from monitoring is here to help also troubleshooting if there is some issue, prevent also some alarms. So I would say that this data aims in fact to help the people that are working day to day on the OTT providers and content creators.
Yeah, I was going to just to add to that, right? It's now that we're in this kind of world of cloud-based deployments, and people are mixing different deployment topologies to achieve both the latency and the quality they want. The monitoring that you guys offer is actually super important, because you want to be able to do that all the way through your chain, and then feed all that data into a central location that actually then allows you to tune and make adjustments and start to run the continuous improvement processes that are driving a lot of that deployment architecture, especially in the cloud, right?
Yeah, we're a service provider, and when you're a service provider, part of it's about providing the service, but another part of it's about kind of demonstrating that you provided the service in detail, and that relationship into the customer in order to demonstrate. So that monitoring stuff is key. One thing I just want to say fairly early on in this conversation is this is not a new topic, and you know, I don't know how many low latency forums I've sat on before, and I've been in other organisations. I was at Tata Communications in my previous role. We launched a low latency service, and what we said was, you take Tata's global fibre network. They own more fibre than anyone else. We did a partnership with Net Insights, and they had some really good network tech to push video over the network. Put those two together, it should be fairly compelling. And spent, you know, quite a lot of my life going out describing what this latency problem was to people. You know, giving the example of being at a beach resort and the match is on in 3 different TVs and different bars. You hear a shout from the bar down the road. You wonder what the hell they're shouting about. And then, you know, you realise the score because your goal comes 3 seconds later on the screen that you're watching. And hey presto, guess which bar is busiest the next night. You know, it's the one that's getting the goals first. But the reality is that it felt a lot, and I'm a product guy, right? So it felt a lot like technology looking for a problem to solve. It wasn't the pull. There wasn't really the pull from the rights holders, the streaming services. Maybe we're seeing a bit of an evolution of that at the moment. Maybe it is kind of coming back onto the agenda. But I think it's interesting to explore, why wasn't it the highest priority? You know, why were the things kind of placed more important than that?
Does that mean, is there a disconnect then between what viewers want and expect and what broadcasters, OTT platforms are prepared to invest in or prioritise? Is that where they're...
Yeah, I'll probably use the wrong analogy here, but I think that there is a thing that we've all got to understand with latency, is that you've got this kind of lever, and let's say you've got 5 levers in front of you. One says scalability, one says cost, one says compatibility with other things in your chain, risk, quality, and then you've got a latency one. And the thing you've got to know is the harder you pull that latency lever, you're watching the other ones drift back up out of place. And there's no free lunch with latency, at least that, you know, there hasn't been. I'm sure Mediakind have a magic pill to it, but that's the reality. And so those other levers, like I want everybody on every device to be able to see the pictures I'm sending out. That's a problem with some of the proprietary low latency services. I want to deliver the feeds at an affordable business case. That's a problem if you're using proprietary networks.
So that's where it comes down to this business case, or the ability to prove.
You both said 2 interesting things, right? It was a technology looking for a problem, which we've done many times in this industry, I think, and also what's that commercial piece, right? So potentially it wasn't an issue before, because if you're watching an event 6,000 miles away, once that delay is fixed to wherever you are, it doesn't necessarily matter a huge amount, right? It only matters once you start to expand the different use cases, whether it's multi routes to that end consumer through a traditional platform or an OTT platform, whether it's now we've got social, and actually that's massively reduced that time scale to getting information around the world, and then betting and kind of data services and gaming that's starting to drive some of these use cases. So really now I think we've got to the point where the use cases have caught up with where the technology has been trying to go. But then Steve made a really good point. Low latency. If you want to do ultra low latency, then you're trading off other levers in that environment, and you've got to know what you're trying to achieve and what you want to achieve for a specific use case, right?
One of the examples you gave was betting, which is obviously feels very current at the moment, particularly what's happening in the US with deregulation. And there's an example that you have, isn't there, Steve, that Redbee's working on?
Well, yeah, we've got an example of where low latency is demanded by the customer, which is an in-store betting service in Sweden. Sweden's deregulated. It's gambling as well. So you can walk into a convenience store, place a bet with one of the licensed betting operators. Our customer Svenska Spel are in a whole load of convenience stores across Sweden. And there's a terminal to bet at, but there's also a TV screen. So we're in Paris now. They take feeds from PMU in Paris, so the horse racing. And to the latency point, how do you best solve latency? It's by being in control of more of the end-to-end. So we've got our kind of equipment in a rack at PMU because we work with them for other services anyway. And then we follow that chain right the way through our NOC in Hilversum to the end user device, and the device is actually an Android TV box. And so we're kind of across that entire chain, which gives you at least a fighting chance of delivering a scalable, reliable, affordable service while working within the standards. So you can always do something proprietary, but this is working within the standards, and that's like 4 or 5 seconds to latency in that service.
So the key to that is the least amount of complexity and complete control over that end-to-end workflow. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's how we solved it in that case, and I think some of if I go back to the previous example I was using when we took the net insight technology and try to solve things, we struggled, I think, because the customers we were talking to were really scratching their head thinking, how many things is this going to affect my ecosystem? And, can I still use DRM? Will my catch-up services still work? The way that the player app has been built wasn't built to talk to that type of service, so how much is that going to cost to change? So I think the examples that I'm seeing, if you look at that technology, which is called Psy, that we deployed, it was actually acquired by Amazon. And Amazon had deployed it within their network, not AWS, but within Prime. So when Prime are streaming sports events, they're now increasingly using this Psy-based technology. And if you think about that, they're in control of lots of parts of the chain as well. They've got their own encoder stack within AWS. They own the infrastructure. They own a lot of the network, and of course, a lot of their users have Fire Sticks going into the TV. So that's really control across an entire chain, and it enables them to be more innovative on latency, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's interestingly. You mentioned standards and ultimately interoperability, right? The more open the network you're delivering over is, and the wider you want to throw that net, the more of a standards-based approach you need to take. So, yeah, you can get some technologies and ways to solve those problems that will give you super ultra low latency, but there's a potential there that doesn't enable you to deliver it to your audience, right? Because you may have an audience that's scattered, through multiple continents worldwide with different levels of technology. It becomes a real challenge. And it becomes a cost problem then, because then that commercial model needs to be balanced off against the value of that latency. And this is now where it's starting to move, because actually there is an argument now to say you can start to implement those low latency and maybe ultra low latency technologies, but it's a trade-off, right? You've got to have the right commercial model.
Yeah, right, and it's worth recognising that's why the standards are as they are. HLS and Dash were invented to enable reliable streaming across, pretty unpredictable networks. The internet wasn't always as robust or mature as it is now, and so the idea was kind of like, what we'll do is put loads of buffers in. We'll buffer the video into 5-second chunks or 4-second chunks. We'll make sure one of those is always on the device. We'll make sure that one's always on the way. And so you de-risk the delivery. And so what you're doing is pulling the reliability lever. And that was probably the most important thing to get scaled video services: reliability of video delivery, not latency. And it's only now that is less of an issue. Networks are more mature. that you can start to think about, well, can we change the standard to adopt to lower latency?
But not necessarily everywhere. So you've got to go to the lowest, not lower, but you've got to be able to support the widest range of those devices, and I think that's a big
On that
challenge.
subject of standards, is there something which, in order to achieve lower latency, you would like to see happen from any of those standards bodies, or in terms of adoption of a particular standard?
I mean, both Dash and now Apple's HLS have got their own low latency kind of variants now, and the question is then how compatible are those? How widely adopted are they? You know, that's kind of the ongoing issue with standards. But I'm not going to get into a standard soup. It'll be. Anything on that?
I think that's fair, but everything certainly that we've looked at and customers we've been speaking to, they've been very keen to try and be as standardised as possible to ensure that they can still get to the widest audience. So it's really important, I think, in this space.
You touched on gambling, and I used my Svenska Spel example, but I think the deregulation in the US market is going to drive this quite a lot. And if you look at someone like Fubo, who, so they had an ad-funded model and a subscription-funded model, doing a lot of sports distribution, and they've moved into becoming a sports book. I mean, so that's not something you would have predicted. Certainly, I wouldn't have 5 years ago. Heavily regulated market in the US around gambling, and now suddenly a sports streaming service is a point of gambling, and that raises loads of kind of ethics questions. I would say, as in the societal problems with gambling. But if you put those to one side, just for a minute, that's where the business case is, I think, in terms of what's the real value of low latency streaming and how do you measure the commercial value? Well, if I'm in match betting and I go to place the bet that Bellingham's going to score, and I find out they actually had scored 20 seconds ago, but I've just missed it because my stream is 30-second delayed, that's not a good betting experience. It's not good for me as the consumer. It's not good for the sports operator. It's not good for anybody. And I reckon that kind of completion of betting, how many bets are being placed in match, you could really measure the value of that very closely with a lower latency.
Yeah.
So what do you think that predictability potentially opens up then? Will that help with the business case? Will that help sort of set out how there can be a return on that?
Yeah, I think in some ways predictability or predictable latency is potentially more important than ultra lowest possible latency, right? You need predictable and repeatable across devices so that you can truly, when people are viewing content and making decisions. And interesting to an example from us with one of the clients we've been working with, it's really been about that. How do we get the latency to the right level with the right predictability on the end devices? And then how do we decorate that stream with the right data inside it to then unlock those use cases? And we've had a couple of different use cases throughout today, right? We've had betting mentioned. We've had selling the last 30 seconds of an event or a match, right? And how do you ensure the entitlements are correct and the right people are authorized? And how do you tie that to the right time in the video sequence, right? So there's all these different things that once you're predictable on your delivery and you manage that latency effectively, you can start to unlock. The question then is, well, if I'm doing the last 30 seconds, am I selling that for more or less than the event itself? Which is the interesting question, I think.
Well, you could make the pitch that watch together sessions wouldn't be as good if everyone was at a different point in the video, but it turns out from the previous session that no one's watching them anyway. So.
I think there was one.
There was one, from a service provider.
Yes. So latency is obviously one element of the quality of experience. How does it rank in terms of other aspects of that? And which would you say is more important? I'm thinking in terms of, say, buffering or quality of the video. Steve?
I mean, again, I'll say I'm a product guy, and I loved whoever it was on the previous session was saying, keep it simple. So simple is I'm able to find the video I want to watch, and it works flawlessly. I think in terms of our customers, I'm seeing a higher desire to get the video looking fantastic on big screens. I think that kind of UHD, HDR, kind of experience is of a higher priority than the latency thing, and they do trade off against each other. So great user experience, great looking video, never fails. If you can solve latency too, that's great. But I think apart from edge use cases, that's the prioritization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting one, and actually, there's different experiences, isn't it? So it's having the same experience, maybe a higher video quality on your big screen, synchronized to your second screen, with that predictable latency at the right quality is really going to help to drive those use cases. I don't know what from a monitoring perspective, how you kind of bring those together and provide the measurements for that, but I think that's quite key, right?
Well, in terms of monitoring, it's true that we only have the beginning of the full chain, because when you are doing OTT, sometimes you don't have, well, most of the time you don't have the end of the network provider for your customer. So you don't know, and you have this amount of, which is this space which is hidden from the monitoring itself. So what we are trying to do is provide, in fact, a lot of insight in your networks with all your equipment, everything, just, as you said, to trying to be predictable, at least in your network, and alarm on trends, on things that can move to avoid having all those kind of issues.
We're talking a lot about video, but of course, sync between video and audio is, that's just a horrible experience when that's out, isn't it? And so that's
a big factor on talking about the quality of experience. I think that's an enormous factor. Yeah. So just finally, you mentioned about gambling and firms involved in betting is potentially sort of helping to push things forward in this space. Are there, just to close off, are there any other examples that you can think of that might be really helping to advance things when it comes to reducing latency? Any other areas that you're seeing that are really pushing things forward? I mean,
the examples that I've heard today are things like the golf, where you've got, I can't remember how many streams was said, but there's tens, close to 100 different streams coming. There's not so much about the latency per se, but the ability to have a rapid switch between feeds, switch from channel to channel. It's almost like a tactile experience that you want on the device, so that you can really feel like you're just bringing up whatever you want to, when you want to, and it just works straight away.
It's that sort of responsiveness. And,
and I think it's all related. It's all related territory to the latency question. But I think the more that you're starting to bring in multiple feeds into an experience, and we've heard quite a few use cases around that today. I think that will drive the innovation.
I guess for me, similar, right? It's the multi-feed and trying to get it there for seamless switching on the end device, betting, and data and gamification. Yeah. I think, generally not just betting, but gamification is driving a lot of the latency conversations. And social, because everyone can get it around the world on social very quickly. So you want to be, from a latency perspective, your content, you want to be getting it to all of those viewers as quickly as possible.
Okay, well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to draw it to a close there. But thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, Chris, Julien, and Steve. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.